The king is dead. King Alexander III of Scotland, having reigned from 1249 and lost all three of his children and heirs, died in 1286 of a broken neck after a fall from horseback in the dead of night. He had been on a trip to see the Queen for her birthday, a journey he would never finish. His passing left his unborn child with second wife and Queen Yolanda as the only potential heir to his throne, until the Queen birthed the stillborn successor. All that was left now was his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret, Maid of Norway, as the only and true heir to the Scottish throne. 6 regents had been chosen as the guardians of Scotland to guide the matters of ascension, but Margaret's father, King Eric II of Norway, was still extremely cautious about sending his daughter to her new kingdom due to persistent pockets of rebellion within the Scottish nobility. Thus, Eric enlisted the help of King Edward of England, effectively forcing the Scottish guardians to do the same. 3-way negotiations ultimately resulted in the Treaty of Salisbury and the agreement for Queen Margaret to wed the son of Edward. This in and of itself prompted a new treaty to confirm the independence from England of Scotland as negotiations continued into 1290. Finally, in the latter half of the year, Margaret departed Norway for her new kingdom. The hard part was supposed to be over, and yet it had only just begun. Partway through the journey, young Margaret had fallen ill and remained thus after landing at Orkney. Days later, she would die in the arms of a bishop, plunging Scotland into a succession crisis like they had never imagined. 13 rival Scottish nobles now vied for the throne. The state of the kingdom was chaotic enough that the Guardians began to fear an outbreak of civil war, and thus, feeling their hands tied and having already worked alongside King Edward to handle matters of succession, reached out yet again to England. Their hope was that Edward could narrow down the claimants to one justified heir and help prevent an armed conflict surrounding the matter. Edward, realizing that he could use this situation to his own advantage and that of England, agreed to meet the Guardians at Norham in 1291 to discuss the matter. Once talks began, the Guardians quickly learned that the King of England wasn't open to doing any unreturned favors. In fact, Edward demanded that if he were to help the Scots, he would have to be recognized as Lord Paramount of Scotland, something that the Guardians outright refused to do. Edward wasn't easy to dissuade, however, and he knew that this was too good an opportunity to pass up. Thus, he gave all of the claimants 3 weeks to agree to his terms, a time frame that would allow his own troops to reach Scotland from England in case their support was needed. But due to the fact that many of the claimants had feared losing their estates in England if they refused, all recognized Edward as Lord Paramount by the end of the 3 weeks. The Guardians had been overridden, and with Edward's foot in the door, it was too late to kick him out. The new Lord Paramount, furthermore, had no intentions of easing his way into Scotland. Instead, he swiftly got to work taking over. With all royal castles being ordered into his care, he went so far as to de-platform all Scottish officials only to then appoint them himself. The wheels were turning and they were spinning fast, making it all but impossible for the Guardians to resist any longer. Consequently, despite their initial defiance, on June 13, 1291, the Guardians of Scotland and leading Scottish nobles pledged allegiance to Edward I of England as Lord Paramount of Scotland. On July 27, 1291, the last of the Scottish common folk were forced to fall in line. With his role in Scotland established, Edward now turns to picking a claimant for the Scottish throne who would benefit his own standing. A series of 13 meetings eventually narrowed things down to two valid options who could trace their ancestry easily back to the royal family: John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and Robert de Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale. Edward then ordered these two claimants to each pick 40 arbiters, while he would pick another 24. When all was said and done, the arbiter majority chose John Balliol to be the new King of Scotland, and Edward happily agreed. His new puppet would be crowned on November 30th at Scone Abbey, and it seems that the Kingdom of Scotland had been subjugated in one war-free summer. It seemed that way. Whether Edward had anticipated it or not, the Scots as a whole were not ready to roll over and accept defeat, particularly not when it came to the faction of Robert de Bruce. He and his men wasted no time putting pressure on the new king, making clear their displeasure with his spineless surrender to the English. As tensions were thrown onto an incline, King Balliol found himself under even more pressure when King Edward summoned him to discuss a new deadline. Only a few years into John's reign, the King of England laid out his newest demand. Balliol must provide Scottish troops and funds for the English invasion of France no later than September 1st, 1294. Now properly wedged between a rock and a hard place, the king returns to Scotland. The council was summoned. The fate of the kingdom once more needed to be discussed. Scotland was one decision away from either securing its status as an English vassal or breaking its chains and feeling the splendor of liberty once more. The council and king discussed and debated for days, sometimes with tempers running high, but others with signs of unity approaching. Finally, a decision was made. The Scots, including Balliol, would deny King Edward his demand. Fully anticipating the wrath this would inspire, John and his nobles began preparing. Within weeks, a new war council was formed, made up of 4 barons, 4 bishops, and 4 earls, and tasked with the job of advising King Balliol in the conflict they'd just inspired. Next, the Scots evaluated what help they could rely on from outside their borders. Who were England's foes? Well, for one, France. Emissaries were shortly on their way from Scotland to inform King Philip IV of France of the impending English invasion, and of course with the hope of winning over French support. The plan worked fairly well, as Philip responded by signing a treaty with the Scots that would require France to support the former as long as Scotland invaded England once the latter stepped foot in France. The deal was then solidified with the agreement to marry Balliol's son to Philip's niece. All was going well for the Scots, and now it was on to Norway. Hoping to double down on building overseas alliances, the Scots next signed a treaty with King Eric II of Norway, although realistically it would be the deal with the French that served them better. Nevertheless, the Norwegians were intended to supply the Scots with 100 ships for 4 months out of the year if the French and English, and thus the Scottish, remained at war. This would be done in exchange for 50,000 groats, but the agreement would end up going unacted upon. Regardless, by now, King Edward of England was on to the Scots. In 1295, the King of England became aware of what is now referred to as the Auld Alliance, learning of the plan for Scotland to invade in defense of the French, and subsequently began bulking up his defenses on England's border with the Lowlands. The following months carried an air of great tension and anticipation. Edward now saw Balliol, who he'd thought would be his puppet, as a new danger to his authority, thus stripping Scotland's king of castles and boroughs. With both monarchs now fully aware of the impending clash, Balliol called all able Scotsmen to arms, and Edward demanded over 200 of his tenants from Newcastle to unite into a militia. The end of 1296's winter and the start of spring saw troops coming together on both sides of the border. It was only a matter of time now. After a minor raid by 7 Scottish earls into Carlisle, the English launched their invasion, but not into France, into Scotland. The words of Bauer's Scottish Chronicon give a grim image of how King Edward's first attack, the sack of Berwick, played out. It was a horrifying start to the First War of Scottish independence. Having made their dramatic entry into Scotland, the English now looked to Dunbar to take the castle of the Earl of March. His wife, a Scot from the Cummin family, had sided with her fellow countrymen and thus allowed the castle to fall into their hands. For that reason, Edward aimed to seize it himself and thus triggered the Battle of Dunbar. The clash was likely a cavalry brawl and saw an uncounted, though possibly low number of casualties, but a clear English victory. Over 100 Scots, including lords and knights, were taken prisoner by the end, and the following day saw the castle surrender to King Edward himself. John Cummin and 3 other earls were thus taken into English custody, and the April 27th tussle seemed to further foreshadow the fate of the Scots and their freedom. And to make matters worse for the victimized nation, their king, John Balliol, abdicated his throne weeks later in July. They were now kingless and defenseless, and in a matter of months, freedomless. By mid-fall, Scotland had been all but subdued by the English. Even the Scots' precious stone of destiny, a fundamental part of Scottish inaugurations, had been captured and taken back to England. Meanwhile, Edward was on his way to Berwick to hold a parliamentary meeting and demand allegiance from the nobles in his recent conquest. He was successful, and all had gone to plan for the English monarch. But all good things must come to an end, even for a king. William Wallace and Andrew de Murray became leaders of Scotland's resistance. The men and their noble allies began launching revolts in early 1297, eventually giving Edward no choice but to send in reinforcements. Many of the nobles capitulated in response to the added English forces, but Wallace and de Murray were more strong-willed. Their resistance continued and eventually culminated in a full-scale military brawl at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. At first, John de Warenne, leading the English troops, attempted to open negotiations with the rebellious Scots in hopes of avoiding an armed clash. The defenders, however, had quite the opposite in mind. Per the words of William Wallace himself, "We're not here to make peace, but to do battle, to defend ourselves and liberate our kingdom. Let them come on, and we shall prove this to their very beards." Reluctantly, the English complied. The battle was on. Flying like rabid dogs from the high ground, the Scots decimated their English opponents. Though Murray was tragically and mortally wounded, the triumph was much needed and a motivating morale boost for the beaten-down Scots. The battle was followed by rebel raids into northern England, and those who still opposed the English vassalship appreciated the efforts of William Wallace, so much so that they named him Guardian of Scotland in March of 1298. Finally, for the Scots, there were celebrations to be had and heroes to be praised. But just as with Edward's time of triumph, this too would not last. Another summer, another invasion. Edward returned to Scotland with a vengeance. The Battle of Falkirk would be a rematch of Stirling Bridge, and this time, it was the English cavalry who took the upper hand. The Scots put up a valiant fight, but in the end, their fiery spirits were not enough to win the day. England had won once more. Due to the fact that Wallace allegedly simply drew up his army in an open field and froze, and it was Murray who was said to have possessed the military genius and military training, it seems that Wallace felt his presence would no longer benefit the liberation cause. It was around this time that the freedom fighter merely disappeared. As a result of Wallace's evacuation, it became necessary to refill the role of Scotland's guardian. Initially, 2 men were chosen: Robert the Bruce and John Cummin. This, though, became pretty blatantly problematic, considering the fact that Robert and John were staunch rivals and required a neutral party to keep things running smoothly. To provide this balance that the Guardians necessitated, William de Lamberton, Bishop of St. Andrews, was named as the 3rd Guardian of Scotland to hopefully neutralize tensions and disputes between his colleagues. By now, the 13th century was fading out, and with the start of the 14th, King Edward of England found a new, invading spirit. Edward's violent campaigns into Scotland picked back up in 1300 and carried on for the year to come. There was a short-lived truce in 1302, but it was just that, short-lived. On February 24, 1303, the war had picked back up at full speed and culminated in the Battle of Roslin. As the English were getting up and going again, John Cummin and Sir Simon Fraser led their Scottish force to catch them off guard. The enemies clashed, and the Scots came out victorious, forcing Edward to once more consider how easy subduing his foes might really be. Battles over castles, Edinburgh and Stirling, marked re-escalations, but ultimately resulted in an English capture of Stirling Castle by 1304. This was the final Scottish stronghold, and it seems that the momentum of the Roslin win hadn't been enough. A year after the Battle of Roslin, most Scottish nobles had now paid homage to the King of England, and a year after that, William Wallace reappeared and was executed. Scotland had been yet again secured as an English vassal. Despite the damage that the 1300 English campaign had done to Scotland, its guardians still had an idea up their sleeve. It's alleged that their plan went as follows. Either Cummin or Bruce would renounce their claim to the Scottish throne, and in turn would receive lands from the other when he thus became King of Scotland. The idea wasn't a horrible one, and seemed viable enough, but unfortunately for the duo, Cummin was a bit too greedy for such a deal. He seems to have assumed that if he warned King Edward of Bruce's plans, Cummin instead would receive both the crown and lands. Thus, that is believed to be what he did, or tried to do, because Robert the Bruce and his allies intercepted Cummin's letter to the King of England. This led to Bruce murdering his co-guardian at the February 10, 1306 meeting at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. Suddenly, Scotland's leadership was in turmoil yet again. Ironically, despite having murdered a very important man in a church and getting himself excommunicated, Bruce found quick support from clergy and noblemen alike. So much so that only 2 months after the death of John Cummin, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scotland at Scone, preparing his new kingdom for a campaign to retake their land and their liberty. The roller coaster of emotions and win to loss that had stained the war thus far was far from over. The Battle of Mithven in June 1306 would starkly contrast the victory of Robert the Bruce being crowned when he and his troops were instead routed by the English in another tragic clash. While exact numbers are unknown, the Scots undeniably took heavy casualties. More Scots fell into English hands as well, including multiple family members of King Robert himself. Still, the tide was near changing yet again. King Edward I of England died on July 7, 1307. His son, Edward II, took the crown in his place. Meanwhile, Robert the Bruce was readying up for another shot at beating out the English. From 1307 to the end of 1308, the Scots were on a roll. The Battle of Loudon Hill saw Robert and his men crush the English in May, then again in August at the Battle of Pass of Brander, and the fight pushed on. After remarkable efforts as the Scots inched ever closer to giving the English the boot, they eventually retook both Roxburgh and Edinburgh castles. Following a lull, fighting picked back up, and in June of 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert again crushed Edward II's forces, and bringing it all full circle, the Scots would eventually retake Berwick as well. April of 1320 would see the Declaration of Arbroath be delivered by Sir Adam Gordon, Bishop Kinninmund, and Sir Odarge de Maupassant to the Pope, confirming Scotland's stance as a sovereign nation. 4 years later, the Earl of Murray was sent to meet with Pope John at Avignon to personally persuade him to recognize Robert the Bruce as King of the Scots. For once, it seems like the roller coaster was slowing down. In 1327, Edward II was deposed from his position as King of England and then murdered, subsequently being replaced by his own son, Edward III. Robert the Bruce and his men carried on their raids in northern England as the new monarch prepared to fight back. The Scots and English met at the Battle of Stanhope, which demoralized and drained the latter so severely that King Edward III was soon forced into negotiations with the Scots. As a result, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed. As of May 1st, 1328, the English officially recognized the sovereignty of Scotland and Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. The catch? Robert's son and heir to the Scottish throne was to marry the sister of King Edward.